All right. Good morning. I'm Kit Walsh from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and we are all here to talk about security and legal issues on the Internet of Things. So in case anyone doesn't know, the Internet of Things is an umbrella term that refers to hardware devices and consumer products that are connected to the Internet. And so as more and more devices that we bring into our homes, that we wear on our bodies, that we drive around the world in are internet connected, the significance of the Internet of Things is growing. And so at my organization, at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, we're involved both on the security research side, on the right to tinker, right to repair side, and look forward to speaking about those issues with you today. And now I'm going to ask my fellow panelists to introduce themselves, and then we will get started and talk a little bit about how your work relates to the Internet of Things.
Sure. So my name is Amie Stepanovich. I am U.S. Policy Manager at Access Now, which is a global human rights nonprofit that does tech policy mainly in how it relates to human rights. So we do quite a bit of work on internet security, and that's really where we come at the Internet of Things. I was doing some research last night and realized that the Internet of Things, that term was coined in 1999, which seems a really long time ago compared to how old the Internet is, which wasn't much older than that, really. And so we started talking about putting sensors in everything a bit over 16 years ago and how that would impact things. And now there are sensors in your cars, in your refrigerators, in your clothing. I was watching a TED Talk I was saying earlier last night that hypothesized that soon they would be in your toothbrush and your cereal box and your soda can, and everything would be sensored together. The problem is a lot of these things can be hacked into because they're not implementing the right security measures. We've heard stories of people having their refrigerators hacked into. I was recently at DEF CON in Las Vegas, and somebody was able to hack into a Linux-powered rifle and cause it to shoot incorrectly. So shoot at things it wasn't supposed to be shooting at. So really, when you start networking things, that security aspect becomes so incredibly important. So that's where we come at it from security policy and making sure that people are taking that into consideration.
Hey, my name is Geoff Termorshuizen. I'm a technical consultant for a payments company called ACI. We handle a bunch of IoT devices such as vending machines, payment processing points, that sort of thing. I've got multiple degrees in political science, MIS, and cybersecurity. And thank you all for coming out early this morning. This is very early for a Monday.
So to give a sort of brief overview of some of the legal considerations. The reason that the manufacturers argue that you don't have the right necessarily to look at the code that's in a device that they've sold you is primarily a side effect of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. So this is a law that was passed in 1998 that makes it unlawful to circumvent a technology that restricts access to a copyrighted work. So think, as Congress thought, of encryption on a DVD in order to prevent people from gaining access to that movie. The studios, manufacturers will put encryption on the disc to restrict what you're able to do with it. And the Digital Millennium Copyright Act is a law that makes that act of circumvention unlawful, in addition to the act of copyright infringement that someone might engage in with that entertainment product. So because the act is defined in terms of copyrighted works, it also extends to copyrighted software. So not all software is copyrightable, but quite a bit of it is. And odds are that if you have a reasonably complex computer program in your Internet of Things device, that it can qualify as a copyrighted work. And now if the manufacturers decided to lock it down, it could indeed be unlawful for you to do something with your own property just to look at the code that's on it, either to understand it, to see how the manufacturer is treating your private data, where it's being sent, to modify it, either for your own privacy or to improve its functionality, or even when something goes wrong, you may need to modify that code to repair it. These are all things that manufacturers argue are infringements of their rights, and you are not allowed to do these things without their permission, which has serious consequences for the repair aftermarket, as well as your ability to maintain something that you buy rather than turning it into electronic waste and buying an entirely new one. So we and a variety of allies are trying to get the Register of Copyrights and the Librarian of Congress to say that a variety of these tinkering activities are completely lawful. Right now it's a legal gray area, but we are working through a rulemaking process to get it established as a clear, bright line exemption to that law, and we're expecting results in October. That's when we're expecting a ruling. Another issue which we spoke about at the vehicle hacking panel is that some manufacturers will try to enforce a license agreement against the purchaser of a product. And if you negotiate with someone, then you can give up your rights to do reverse engineering, to make derivative works. And the manufacturers are taking the position that the license that's stuck on the outside of the box, or that you have to click through when you activate the device, is just as good as a negotiated agreement, and they can enforce those terms to keep you from doing things that you otherwise would have the right to do. And so that will vary quite a bit from state to state, from manufacturer to manufacturer, but it's another legal issue that arises in the context of the Internet of Things, and one that we're working on combating. So, do either of you want to talk about specific Internet of Things related? Is there any legislation at the moment in the field of Internet of Things that you've been tracking, or maybe we can open it up to questions if.
Yeah, just real quick, just because it all ties in together. There is a law right now. So one of the things that Congress is really interested in right now is cybersecurity. The reason they're interested in cybersecurity, as some of you may have been maybe aware, or as some of you may have been impacted by, the Office of Personnel Management just had a very, very, very large data breach where a lot of people's information got out. And every time something big like that happens, Congress feels the need to react. So they've reacted several times as different data breaches have occurred. Target, Home Depot, all of these things have perpetuated them to push forward cybersecurity legislation. But the OPM breach has been a big push. The problem is what they're pushing through is really it's not a cybersecurity bill, it's a surveillance bill in disguise. And they want to facilitate information going to government and going to companies, but they don't want to protect the networks anymore. So while there isn't what we would call a very good cybersecurity bill that would impact the Internet of Things, really encourage the use of encryption, encourage training, encourage companies to build in secure tools, that is what we are pushing for. So we are pushing for Congress to reject these kind of surveillance bills that aren't going to do security, and start to look at developing, drafting, and introducing a pro-security bill, and that would have implications for the Internet of Things as well, because how many people think it's kind of cool that you could go to the supermarket and your refrigerator would talk to your phone and tell you you're out of milk, and you can then buy milk, because that's kind of cool. I'm out of milk all the time, and I don't always remember when I'm at the store. But I don't also want somebody malicious breaking into the said refrigerator and being able to tell what I'm eating and drinking and when I'm home based on energy use. I think that's a little bit more creepy. So I would like to have these tools secured and locked down, and the right structures put into place for that.
And it's not just a malicious hacker who might intrude on your privacy. Often these devices are configured in a way that leaves you vulnerable to the manufacturer. And if you are not allowed to understand or modify how the device works, then your fridge might be sending information back to the manufacturer of that fridge. A variety of video game sensors and smart TV cameras have had issues where people have discovered they're sending either audio recording data back to the manufacturer, or otherwise operating sensors in your house that you may not be happy with and might want to alter the way that's working. On the security front, it's also the case that one of the reasons that we fight for users' ability to look at the software on their devices is so that third parties can audit the security of those devices, because in many cases, the internet connection on an Internet of Things device is a bit of an afterthought, and there may be some cool functionality that can be enabled by it, but the consequences of exposing that device to connections over the internet haven't been thought through. So if any of you are following the Jeep hack that was discussed just last month, This was a scenario where a car was connected to the internet, and this meant that over the internet, someone could take control of the brakes, the steering, variety of other functionality that could potentially, endanger the driver or intrude on their privacy by tracking their location.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that car one wasn't just here's something that might happen. They actually did it. They, the example that they used was they arranged with a writer from Wired, and they actually shut his Jeep Cherokee down on the highway while it was doing 70 miles an hour. So it wasn't just hey, this might happen. It was a practical demonstration that it can, here's it actually happening. Mm-hmm. And the other thing with the IoT the IoT devices is that it creates multiple security holes, because while your network may be wonderfully locked down from your point of view, a hacker may be able to get into your network via your fridge or via your sewing machine or via your washing machine. Simply because with there being very little security, it becomes a place that people can break into and gain access to what they shouldn't be gaining access to.
Yeah, and just to tie, I think, these two ideas together is the idea that you actually want good people who know security looking into the security holes. You want them to have access to the code. You want them to be able to try to break in. Because if a vulnerability exists that allows somebody to break into your car, your fridge, your gun, your Fitbit, I'm sure you would rather have that patched. And so what security researchers actually allow companies to do is to patch security holes instead of allowing them to perpetuate, so that the first person that takes advantage of that is not somebody who means to do you harm.
Right. That the ability of independent researchers to do that research and then go public with it is how we put pressure on manufacturers so they don't just downplay the vulnerabilities of their devices, because they are interested in protecting their brand image, and through public pressure, we're able to get these things fixed. So I think we're ready to open it up to questions. If you can share what you are thinking about in the context of the Internet of Things and what concerns you have, we'd be happy to address it.
I had a question and one comment. You mentioned the fridge talking to you to remind you about buying milk. I'm not sure I want my scale talking to my fridge when I go to get ice cream. Is there any legislation or anything saying that we're going to support this product through till this point? Like home routers, they get vulnerabilities and you're just expected to throw them away. Mm-hmm. I don't want to have to change every light switch and receptacle in my house like every 3 or 4 years. And some of these things are running like, I've seen like incidents where a kiosk or something is running like Linux kernel 2.2. That was released like a decade ago.
Mm-hmm.
The short answer there is it depends. Congress by itself won't, just because it's a lot of work and they've got other things they want to do. So it really depends on who brings it to their attention. If it's just you as a single person, again, they're not going to pay attention to it. If you start getting lobbying groups like EFF and similar groups together, they'll start paying more attention to it. But unfortunately, Congress, like Amie was saying, Congress tends to be reactive. So they only start jumping onto that sort of thing once things start going badly. Going back to the car example, though, that cars were vulnerable was discovered as far back as 2011. And the industry's answer at that point was, Congress, don't worry about it. You have to have physical access to the car because you had to actually plug into the I/O port on the car to be able to hack it at that point. And until it was actually demonstrated 5 years later that no, as you guys have released technology like Bluetooth wireless, we can now get to it anywhere. That was the first time it was taken seriously, and that resulted in like 1.4 million cars being recalled, and a whole bunch of little USB drives being sent out to folk, because while you could hack it over the internet, they couldn't patch it over the internet. Mm-hmm. And then the downside is that if you take your car in and the mechanic fixes it, that's one thing. But if you use that USB key to fix it yourself, most people don't know how, so they're not going to bother. So for a long time yet, we're going to have a bunch of devices that will pretty much always be vulnerable, simply because people think it can happen to me. I don't want to pay to go. I don't want to pay to have it happen, and a lot of it is just people not being aware and not taking active steps into essentially making someone do that. And so it depends on what happens and who makes the loudest noise.
The patching thing has been a big problem that has been discussed. The question of how do you patch some of these things, and for a lot of the products it hasn't been solved yet. A further question for that is, how many of you have received like an app update on one of your apps needs to be updated, and when you go to update it, it says we need all of these additional permissions, we need to look at all of this other data, and so it's making sure that when your Internet of Things devices get updated, get patched, that they're not also trying to work in additional collection that they're not telling you about. Because how is your light bulb going to tell you that now we're also collecting some other piece of data that we weren't collecting before, and how can you consent to that? So there are some additional questions of making sure that we're not patching and increasing what is watching you.
I got a question there. Is there anything that says that the devices that go out have to be able to be patched versus simply writing a firmware that is non-rewritable and sending out the chip that there's no way to update it? Mm-hmm. And pretty much you forever having that vulnerability there, short of physically swapping out the actual chip itself.
And this is one of many things that we're looking at what would actually be in a really good law. There is no requirement for that right now.
Well, and one of the things that we are doing to move the law is to open up the opportunity for third parties to provide those services. So particularly if the manufacturer hasn't been doing a good job securing your device, don't you want there to be an ecosystem where you can go to some other software vendor to provide the firmware to run your device? And as it stands right now, the way that most courts have interpreted the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, that anti-circumvention provision I was talking about earlier, is they don't allow a defendant to make fair use arguments. So this is the copyright doctrine that says, like, yes, you've done something that potentially implicates copyright. You made a copy, you made a derivative work, so you altered the software, but it was fair. And one of the uses of copyrighted works that's considered fair by the courts is reverse engineering, to understand how something works, to make new software that'll work with it. And that's a really important part of the history of copyright law that's protected a lot of innovators. And now, with the way the Digital Millennium Copyright Act is being interpreted, you can't make that argument. If you have to circumvent something to get access to the code in order to do that reverse engineering, then the majority of the courts, so not all the courts, but the majority say you can't make that fair use argument. So that's the quick legislative fix that we're pushing for. That is Olofgren's Unlocking Technology Act, which would say the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, you're only liable if you do it in furtherance of actual copyright infringement, and then that opens up all of the reverse engineering uses and other cultural, like remix uses, that the DMCA has locked down somewhat unintentionally. So that is in the legislature something we're pushing for, and then we're also working for that in administrative agencies and litigation.
And remember that all this legislation really only hurts the good people, because the bad people are going to ignore it anyway. So any law pretty much on the books is there as a reactive device, because there's no law in existence that actually stops someone from doing something. If you want to do it, you'll do it. The only thing the law does, it provides after the fact ability for someone, manufacturer, the state, whoever, to take steps against you for doing something. So the only thing that these laws actually hurt are those who are trying to do like third-party work where they're actually trying to help, but they've been legally stopped from helping anyone because the bad guys just don't care. They're going to do it anyway.
Okay, so I know there's a huge deficit in infosec talent. Is there anything that you guys see coming to the forefront to sort of fix these problems, be it, more focus on that as a CS degree, or crowdsourcing, or any like open source software, that kind of stuff?
Do you want to start?
I'd say academically there is more growth in the CS field. You're seeing more and more universities developing courses for that, and even starting to develop specialized courses within that field. It is considered one of the biggest growth fields within probably the next 10, 15 years. simply because we're not going to get any less complicated in what we're doing. But I don't think there's any official drive for it, but universities and tech colleges and whatnot are starting to create specific cybersecurity courses, which in some cases are actually separate from computer science.
Go ahead.
Near and dear to my heart, there are also within those courses special groups and different organizations set up to help specifically women who want to enter computer security or who want to start coding, which is really great because the diversity of viewpoints that you need in order to make sure you're addressing a lot of different situations. If you only have one person thinking one way or one type of person thinking one way, you're not going to get all of the holes. So you need a lot of different people thinking a lot of different ways from a lot of different backgrounds. And so there is an increasing awareness that you need to get more diversity.
And at the Hacking 101 panel, some of the experts were talking about ways to break in and start to learn about hacking and infosec. And in addition to sort of formal university resources, including online courses, they also discussed the importance of community groups and gave a couple of good online and written published resources, and they said they're going to make that available. So either the stream of the video from that panel, or if there is somewhere a list of the resources that were mentioned, might be a good place for someone who's interested in taking their first steps to look.
If you are going to do that, please do join such a group, because you really don't want the police showing up in your house going, hey, we've discovered you've been researching bomb making techniques or something along those lines. And that is a problem. One of the anecdotes was being passed around when I was doing my CS degree was that some folk from Oracle had come to campus just for some sort of a business trip. And the first thing that the university had found out that something was wrong was when the police showed up. And it turned out that one of the courses, one of which I took, we actually had to plan an attack on Omaha. As in, you had to just use the internet and see what was available. Could you get maps for different public facilities? Could you get maps to source what you would use for, say, making physical bombs and whatnot? Could you get the resources for making those things? And the Oracle folk had found a printout of one of these presentations lying on one of the printers. And they had figured, this was actually some student who was just going off the wall. So since then, we've been told from the get-go, whenever you're doing this, market as for educational use only. And wherever you are, if you're doing this like a business, let your business know that you're doing this, so that if they find it, they're not coming across and having, police waiting for you when you get to your desk the next morning. So yeah, there is security in joining some of these groups that you can say, I'm part of this group and they can be backed up and I'm doing research into this. I'm not actually just being malicious.
So commercial IoT devices notwithstanding and their concerns, if you have, say, a fleet of Raspberry Pis running your cooking appliances or 3D printers, et cetera, within your home, what sort of, any devices that I have that run that, I'm not going to even pretend to think that I don't have any vulnerabilities in those. Aside from just really trying to make sure that your router's up to snuff, is there any, I guess, guidance you would give in terms of making sure that you're well protected in terms of, I don't want somebody overcooking my dinner for fun over the internet?
Geoff, do you want to field that?
Well, first thing is you have to figure out how your device is busy doing what it's doing. Like you say, if it's plugged into your LAN, that's one thing, because you can always block out with filtering or something. If it's using a cell signal, for example, that's not going to do any good. Wi-Fi, again, may go through your router, but a lot of things are going to cell now so that they can become independent of relying on something else being there. And I don't really know of any way to practically do that short of creating like a Faraday cage around your entire house. And that's just completely impractical. So if it's something that's physically accessing the internet via your router, absolutely. Find out what either functionality within the firmware that you have can do that on your router. I know WRT routers are very popular because they made a bunch of third-party firmware that you could download onto your WT routers, which gave you a whole lot more functionality over what was going through it. So check what's available to you as far as that goes. But the biggest thing is find out how your device is doing whatever it's doing. Because in some cases you may be able to block it. In other cases you may just be stuck being aware that there is something like that, and you may want to segregate it from anything else so that it can't talk to anything on your local network.
So the question also brought to mind, what's at stake in terms of hacking? So if your dinner is overcooked, that's not necessarily a disaster. Or if someone hacks into your fridge and all your food is spoiled, but when you have a lot of the same device hooked up to the internet and they all share the same vulnerabilities, then the potential damage is different from just one person's appliance going down. Geoff, what do you think about the sort of harm that comes from an attack at scale, and are manufacturers thinking about that?
I'd seriously doubt manufacturers thinking about it, simply because, like Congress, no one's actually made them do it yet. And like you've seen with the car industry, even once they know about it, if it's not actually going to affect their bottom line, they're not going to fix it. Something happens that it does happen. Honestly, as far as IoT devices go, short of them being something like a payment system device, like a Apple kiosk, a vending machine, something where there's actual money involved, I think the biggest danger for non-surveillance things, so like other than your home camera system or your home whatever you've got there, is that a lot of these things may be used as points for running DDoS attacks or running spam, because most people wouldn't think about it, but there are probably a few million, actually there are definitely a few million washing machines, dryers across the US. Now, if someone could get, say, all the Whirlpool or all the LG ones to sit and host basically botnets, there's a huge resource there that's waiting to be tapped by someone who's not willing to do it, who's not a very nice person. On a non-malicious but still annoying side, you've got folk who may start using your devices to do Bitcoining. So basically, your fridge, your washing machine is basically making someone else money. So yeah, aside from like they're saying just the annoyance factor and ruling out anything that's related to security specifically, there are still a number of issues why you really don't want your device being hacked.
So there's almost like a scale of companies thinking about security. There are the purely internet-based companies who don't always think about security, but at least exist on the internet and know that security has to be something that they consider at some point. There are the non-internet companies that deal with the internet, like brick and mortar stores who have a website who collect user data, who really we have not yet seen them kind of make that jump into thinking that digital security is a thing. And now we're even taking a step further back to like the manufacturers who typically don't even deal with people at all. And now they're building this technology and this the Internet of Things into what they're doing. And so trying to get them to think about security is even harder than either of the other ones. And the other companies are not always thinking about security to begin with. And the problem is that they don't necessarily see that it affects their bottom line, because there's this big problem in corporate, not only corporate America, in the corporate world, that it's not going to happen to me. I'm not going to suffer a hack. That happens to Sony, that happens to Target. It's not going to happen to my company or my device. And so they don't see the need to invest a lot of money, because security can be very expensive, investing a lot of money up front for something that they see a very small chance of the likelihood that it's going to happen, which is this big data breach that could have huge consequences for people.
And you've also got an additional item there, because even if it does happen, there's a whole liability issue of who's liable. If your washing machine explodes because of a bad chip, is it the washing machine manufacturer that has the problem? Is it the chip maker who's liable? Is it the guy who wrote the software for that chip that's liable? There's going to be a whole lot of finger pointing as far as that goes. And unfortunately, a lot of those things wind up being settled for minimal payment to the actual people who are affected by it. The lawyers make a whole bunch of money out of it. And a lot of times those terms include things like the company not having to admit liability. They're like, well, we'll take care of it, but we're not going to admit we're liable for it. So it's going to be a long road before we actually start getting to these things, because I'm not aware of any major cases where it's been an issue of liability that have come up yet. But that's going to be something that's going to hit us.
Oh, the surveillance devices. How can you find them and tell if they are sending information and disable them if possible.
Geoff, you want to?
It depends on it depends on what sort of device you're talking about.
I mean, like say like a camera on an Xbox or something. If you have I forgot what it's called, the Kinect. Like, how do you know if something like that is transmitting surveillance information?
If you're non-technical, your best bet is pretty much to research it, because other folk who have done research will be saying, here's what to look for, specifically as far as that goes. If you are technical and you're comfortable with it, you can actually do that yourself by running things like packet sniffers on your network, seeing what's coming from the IP that's assigned, because for it to transmit to someone, with one caveat on that, for it to transmit out of the internet, it has to have an IP address. So it's not too difficult. It's actually very easy to monitor those addresses within your local network and see what's going across there. First off, if you're not expecting anything to go across, the thing to check is there any traffic coming from this device? Once you determine that there is, then you can start looking with deep packet inspection to see what sort of data is going across there. Is it video data? Is it just random checks to see, to just let the know that, yes, I'm still here? The one caveat to that is phones or cameras and whatnot which broadcast just to a receiver, like you've got a wireless camera or something along the line that's not an actual IP cam, because folk can sit outside your house and hack into your entire system that way, sitting in their car without ever connecting to your network, because the functionality of the device itself is actually just to broadcast a radio signal, which can then be picked up by pretty much any monitor that can monitor that wavelength.
Yeah. And from a non-technical perspective, I mean, a lot of times people are trying to make it so you don't know that they're hacking into those devices. So I have things like this little sliding device over my camera, because you never know necessarily when somebody is going to be breaking into that. And some people call this paranoid, but most of the people I know who work in government, who work at spy agencies, have the same thing, oddly enough. So I don't necessarily think that's paranoid, but if you have a camera that is attached to the internet in some way, either through your Xbox or on your computer or on your phone, and there's something you don't necessarily want that watching, making sure that it's blocked when you're not using it is never a bad practice.
If you go to a security research conference, about half of the cameras will have a sticky note over them, and the other half have an EFF sticker over them, which makes us pretty happy. And if we actually have stickers that are designed for that purpose, the adhesive is easier to peel off and put back on. And we have a bunch of them at our booth back in the back left corner of the Hilton. We're running a table, and access is right next to us if you want to pay us a visit after the panel.
And I know it's on the wrong side right now. I have it on the wrong side purposefully because I've been taking photos with this camera while I've been at DragonCon. But I have a cover over it too.
You had a question. Can we get him the mic, please?
Okay, so going back to your security point, there's an episode of CSI Cyber where basically a hacker with a grudge hacks into a person's home, and they overutilize the printer's fuser, causing a fire, killing that person. So that's the type of thing. I know this is over exaggeration or something like that, but these are the type of things that we're thinking about with security, threatening someone's life. Is that plausible? That's the question.
Oh yeah, Stuxnet did exactly that. Stuxnet. What was really fantastic about Stuxnet, which I don't know if you guys all aware what Stuxnet is? Okay. It did two things. One, it did not advertise itself. It was designed to be hidden. And the second thing that it did was it actually intercepted it took over the controller for these centrifuges, and it told them how to run. So it would overrun them on purpose or underrun them, or actually have them bounce up and down until they broke. But it would also report back to the sensors monitoring those things that everything was fine. So I'm not too worried about a Stuxnet level virus getting into my washing machine, but absolutely being able to get in there and fiddle with those things, both in making adjustments to the device and hiding those adjustments from whatever's monitoring those things, is absolutely plausible. Because we've already seen it happen at the industrial level. I think it's really just more of a case of we have not reached a critical mass of IoT devices yet that something like that's happened yet.
I mean, he was talking about a car that got shut down going 70 miles per hour on the highway. If my car got shut down when I was going 70 miles per hour on the highway, I'd be in a lot of trouble. There are a bunch of nerds out there who love watching shows like CSI Cyber and Scorpion and then commenting on them and on the realism within the show. And it's always a really great read. Those are things that you like doing, if you like watching the mass media about hacking, going and then reading the commentary about that. I've only seen one episode of CSI Cyber. It was the pilot about them hacking into baby monitors. And there was actually an amazing story in Forbes by a reporter named Kashmir Hill the year before about the realities of how people could hack into baby monitors and what they could see and how that whole ecosystem worked. So there are often news stories that you can access that these stories are based upon loosely and then get the reality behind them.
Other thing, how many of you guys have kids? How many of your kids' friends have come over and you've given them the password to get onto your network for whatever reason? Bear in mind that they may be bringing devices over as well that may not be secured the way you are. And that it may be possible for an infected device from that way to get into your network and start infecting other devices there. Now, it doesn't mean you need to block off your friends from coming over. But just be aware of such things. So, if they come over, give them a sticker to stick over their camera. Make them aware that these things are going on. Because while they're probably going to be embarrassed and ignore you if you yell at them about it, if you just make this part of, this is what I do, this is what I need you to do, please, it actually helps spread that word and helps people become more aware of such things, not at a subconscious level, but at a non-overt level. And that really does help.
This goes for your friends as well, and as for your tenants. I actually had my former landlord write into my lease that I wasn't allowed to give out the Wi-Fi password to anybody because of this exact consideration. So anybody you let on your Wi-Fi or any home that you run that you don't want compromised, just to make sure that you're keeping that in mind.
I'm sorry, I got one more question. I came in late, but basically when I think of IoT, I think of these things that hook up to your smartphone, like you said, surveillance cameras, door openers. Did you? I came in late, like I said. Did you explain like the whole security holes for those types of devices?
How do you security holes in what sense? Other than that they exist?
Yeah. Like you said before, maybe like. Sniffing the network. Are there any other holes, security holes like for that?
We kind of touched on that earlier, and basically the biggest thing is see how it's communicating with the outside world. Is it going across your network? In which case, it's fairly easy to do something about it. If it's cellular, it may be a lot more difficult because you're going to have to block the cell signal. And probably worst case if it's both network and cellular. Like a lot of alarm systems are. They'll use the network for day-to-day stuff, but they'll also have the cell signal in case someone does cut your normal access, that they can still get out and alert who needs to be alerted. So the biggest thing is see how your device is communicating with the outside world, and then from there see what your options are.
Actually, a non-security hole, but a hole nonetheless that you want to be aware of, is what the data you're giving to people says about you. There was a very interesting, I don't know, does anybody wear a Fitbit?
The girl is having sex?
Yeah, a
For
girl
now.
wore a Fitbit while having sex, and you were able to see on her publicly shared information that was the type of activity that was occurring. So it was in her normal physical activity, she clearly identified it, but once you were able to see that was the pattern, you could pick that out. So it's not only a matter of the security holes that are technological, but it's almost like social engineering. Like, what is the data that you are voluntarily releasing saying about you that you might not be aware of that it's saying about you, and do you want that to be shared publicly? And then make decisions accordingly.
So you spoke a bit about the complications currently existing with manufacturers and them not being aware of what happens when they hook up, when they add internet to their devices or that sort of thing. Can you speak a bit about the future of that area, particularly with regards to forcing some checks and balances, making them be aware of what happens, making them aware of security vulnerabilities and best practices, or even
forcing them to, because again, just because you put in a legal boundary doesn't mean that smaller manufacturers are necessarily going to pay too much attention to that, because there's not a lot of incentive to.
Mm-hmm. Geoff, do you have anything to say?
We touched on this earlier as well. It's that most manufacturers need to make money. They're not going to do a whole lot of things that are going to cost them money for not much increase. So that's why it takes a lot of time for us to see those things coming into effect. As far as forcing them, like manufacturers, Congress is also reactive. They tend to make very bad proactive laws, and so most of the laws that come around are usually reactive. And because they're reactive, they're normally coming on the tail of something really bad that's happened. So they tend to be as fast and as quick as possible. And most Congress people are not, or pretty much the entire Congress is not technical at all. So when something like this comes up, they start finding out who amongst the folk that they know are technical, which usually ones being the lobbyist group. Lobbyists are usually working for the manufacturers, and they want it to be very pro-manufacturer. So it may be a case of that you cannot hold someone liable, like they kind of did with the Patriot Act with the ISPs, where it's like you could not hold an ISP liable for giving out your data. Or it could be like Patriot Act, where they just said, all right, we're going to get everything. We're going to cover every possible base, whether it's good, bad, or otherwise, so that we can get something in. And only after the fact do we start feeling the fallout from it, which is where groups like the EFF can get into it, and they start going, this is a very bad idea, this is why you need to change it. And then we go back to the start of the loop, where it's very hard to get Congress to do anything that's non-reactive. So your best bet there is to get involved with groups like EFF and join those campaigns and let your own people know, your Congress people, your senators, start campaigns within your group. Now, I don't know if this is true for all states, but within Georgia, if you get a 10,000 person signature ballot on something or poll on something, and you submit it to your congressperson, that counts as one item. So what you want to do there is you want to get all 10,000 of those people to actually go and contact their representative directly, because then it becomes 10,000 people paying attention to something. And that's usually when Congress gets involved, because you're now talking votes to them. And so they want to make whoever's making the loudest noise happy.
We go back to the fact that this is a relatively new area and people are still trying to figure it all out. And it's taken a long time to get even to the point in the US where you're told what permissions apps are asking for on your phone. Hopefully we'll figure out a way to do that with the Internet of Things. Another option is potentially moving to a more European system where you have a right to data protection and you own the data collected about you by companies. And that actually is a forcing function for companies to think about what data they're collecting and to be honest with their consumers, because it's your data, it's not their data. So that's another possibility. And then we always want to keep in mind the Federal Trade Commission, which is becoming more active on security. And if there's a practice that you can say is unfair or deceptive, and increasingly bad security practices are unfair if they're going to be collecting information about you, you can file an FTC complaint, and that company could be hit with a quite hefty fine if they're not doing something properly. So there are a lot of different avenues. I think some of the question that you're going to ask is going to just be solved with time. Hopefully not before a really bad thing happens. We want to see the innovation on notifying people and having them know what's going on about them and protecting their data up front, and not 5 years later when, all of your devices are broken into and part of a botnet, and we have decided that we're going to let security go until there's a huge thing that forces us to think about it. We want to think about it before a really bad thing happens.
And in terms of policymakers being reactive, in the world of automobile software, that research that happened in 2011 showing what you could do if you plugged into the car, and then 2012 showing what you could do over Bluetooth. So not even just over the internet, but just if you're in physical proximity to the car, you could take it over wirelessly. That did prompt a reaction. Both Senator Markey sent a bunch of scathing questions to the auto manufacturers, both about like what are you doing to secure vehicles, but also after the spat between Tesla and the reporter who gave the Tesla a bad review, and Tesla said, well, all the data we collected about you shows something different than what you narrated. Then lawmakers were like, what do you mean all this data you collected about the driver? And so Senator Markey asked a bunch of questions. Earlier this year, published a report basically explaining how manufacturers ignored warnings of security researchers, but putting some pressure on them to do better. The National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration has been working with manufacturers to create some better safety standards. So in terms of getting an actual improvement in practices, it doesn't necessarily need to be a disaster or malicious exploit. Independent security researchers can play a role there. And one thing that companies can do is learn how to be friendly to independent security researchers who are telling them they have a problem with their product. Because when you are a company that doesn't have a lot of experience dealing with security research, and someone says, I found a vulnerability that I or someone could use to hack this device that you're selling, a lot of the companies who are sort of noobs in that world, their first reaction is to talk to their lawyers and send a cease and desist letter, and then we wind up seeing the security researchers at our Coders' Rights Project, where we help to advise them about how to go forward or how to structure research before they get to that point. But once a company has some more experience dealing with security, they tend to get better at realizing, like, oh, okay, these people aren't threatening us. They're actually providing a service that's going to help us improve the product. So that's something companies can do. And I'm sure there are also the design considerations. Geoff, if you have thoughts about what sort of Internet of Things manufacturer could do to design their device more safely, particularly if it's something mechanical like a washing machine, maybe there could be a physically enforced safety measure rather than relying entirely on software to make the product safe to use.
That is a good question. Honestly, I don't know if I have a good answer for that or not. Simply because, having something physical like a latch or something, for example, on your washing machine that you actually have to flip. But again, that's not going to stop when it's actually in motion from having someone change it there. Or if there's a certain percentage change, that there's an interlock that kicks in, that if it says, all right, I've gone from, say, 10 revolutions per second to 100 revolutions per second, it'll actually kick in a stop that says, all right, we're just going to cut everything at this point until someone comes and tells us what's going on. I think the biggest problem there is going to be finding a way, or actually coming up with a way to do that practically. Mm-hmm. Because yes, it's very easy to conceptualize these things, but a lot of times. So for example, let's say on the washing machine, you've got a huge increase in your RPMs, and the device goes in and kicks it out. If you walk up, all you know is that your device stopped working, which means that the manufacturer has to provide some way of telling you, this is why we stopped it, and it wasn't just something that was broken. We actually stopped it for a reason, which means they've got to design a whole lot more software to be able to run those diagnostics. They've usually got to add in something like a bigger display then to tell you what's going on. Or you've got to do something like they've got to provide you the book of like code numbers so that you can look up which code's on the display that's popping up there. And I do think that's going to be something of a issue, getting them to that point. And a good example of that is the rotary saws. For decades, you could get a table saw that if you stuck your arm there, just cut it off. It was relatively recent that you've actually got it now where, I don't know if this is mandated across all devices or just for the folk who developed it, but there's a very, very minor charge running around a lot of the devices now. And if that charge gets broken, like by someone touching it, it actually slams a lock into that blade that stops the blade dead. And they did it with a Vienna sausage, and that thing's got less than a 1/4 inch cut into it, which is still going to be painful, but it's a whole lot less painful than breaking or losing an arm or something along those lines. Mm-hmm. And then again, you get into DMCA issues there, because if one company develops it, is it now intellectual property that only they can use it, and everyone else is going to develop their own safety features, or is it something which Congress could step in and say, look, this is a safety feature. You can license this, but everyone has to start using this technology because it's making you safer. So I think that we'll see that happening piecemeal based on what the particular device is. And it's going to be even a longer time before we start seeing that than before we start seeing just basic security going into these things.
And we're kind of dealing with a weird double-edged sword. We're not talking about security, but we are, like, what they do know is they want all the data. And so I have this one of my favorite stories is I was in a room with a representative of a fairly prominent car manufacturer that I will not name. And it got brought up, should we have private driving mode? You know, your car now has all these sensors in it. Should you have a private driving mode similar to private browsing on your internet browser, where you can turn off all the sensors? If you want to drive somewhere sensitive and you don't want the manufacturer collecting that, should that be a possibility? And the manufacturer's like, well, we can't turn off all of the data we collect because then it won't be safe. We'll be making drivers less safe. And I was in a room with a lot of privacy advocates, and we all looked at each other and were like, how long have they, like, how were we safe before they started collecting all of this data?
Right.
Because this is a relatively new phenomenon. And she, like, was very serious. We will not be safe if we stop collecting data. Versus, like, you never used to collect data. Like, my car is not that old, and I don't have sensors throughout it. So I think we also have to be aware that you can't, like, if you're going to collect all of the data about users and not think about security, you're really doing a huge disservice to the people you're selling to.
And don't feel bad to go and ask them about it. Did anyone actually ask her, how are we going to be less safe?
No, there was not. It was not a question and answer.
But don't feel bad. A lot of times they'll try and make you feel bad about asking questions like this because they'll make it sort of the worst case scenario, like you won't be safe, or think of the children. We had a lot of the legislation going to try to push through with COPA, SIPA. Everything was like, oh, you got to stop child pornography. Okay, but how does that mean that the ISP has to monitor my emails for the past 6 years? So question these folk. If they say, we need your social security number. Well, why do you need it? I'm signing up for cable service. Okay, well, we don't really need it. We can get around that. Ask them, every time that you're giving out something that's going to be person identifiable, ask them, what are you guys doing with it? What do you do after the fact with it? I rented a couple lenses for my camera a couple weeks ago, and part of that is they take your social security number. And I asked them what that's for. It's basically so that if you skip out on these lenses, which can be thousands of dollars, we can track you down. I was like, okay, what do you do the data after you're done? And they say, all right, well, we write it down on a piece of paper. They can store it in a safe, and when you return the lens and we clear it, we take their paper and we shred it. I was being, okay, that's great. Now, I've got no way of seeing if they actually did it, but they could answer my questions reasonably about that. So don't feel bad to ask folk, why are you asking this information? What are you doing with it? What happens to it after you're done with it? Honestly, that's probably your biggest thing there, is just bug people about that, and bear in mind that a lot of your frontline people just won't know those answers. And so ask them, go ask your supervisor. Go get someone on the line who does know these things, because I want to give you money, but I want to make sure that I'm not giving you more than just my money.
And to go back to Amie's example of cars are a great example, a great way to talk about Internet of Things, because when manufacturers come out and say, we can't let people not send us data when they're driving around, we can't let people repair their own cars or make improvements to cars, it's sort of very easy to be skeptical about that and point to the 100-year history we have of people repairing their own cars, learning a love of engineering by tinkering with their cars, making new technologies that keep us safe, like rear view mirrors and help the environment, like catalytic converters. Like, actually, people who tinker with their own devices can make a huge contribution. And we're going to hear those same arguments for every new Internet of Things device, and it's going to be equally bogus that users have nothing to contribute, or that you need to be locked out of your own devices for your safety, particularly when they're collecting data about you. I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, I wonder if you could mention any online forums that have a pretty decent signal-to-noise ratio that can continue this conversation, so we can learn best practices and what's going on.
EFF, definitely. They're probably the single biggest source for that. Other ones are just Google security conferences and check their pages, see who their speakers were, track them down that way. Between those, we'll cover pretty much anything you want as far as that goes. I don't know if you guys are a similar group, Amie.
We are a heavily tech organization. We were founded around tech. Most of our resources, we have a lot of resources right now, but they're mostly consumer directed, so tools that those people in the room can use. We don't have like a, I don't know if you're asking for like a discussion. There's a Twitter for EFForums though that I'm staring at on my name tag right here. Maybe it's time to start a forum where people can discuss these issues. I'm not aware of anywhere where it's like proactively happening right now.
So I think in terms of people who are experimenting with the technologies, it's a lot of different forums that are particular to the kind of device. So if you're talking about cars, then there's like open garages. If you're talking about like, I want to learn how to take my device apart, iFixit is a great resource. And then in terms of the legal issues, if you come to the EFF website, we have a guide to coders' rights and right to tinker type stuff. Mm-hmm. And you can also follow what's going on. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're expecting a ruling on a bunch of right to tinker questions from the Librarian of Congress in October. So if you check in with us then, or if you follow us to get updates, then we'll see what happens and whether that's an opportunity to get involved, either to celebrate a good ruling or to do some action around bad ruling. And if you want to continue the conversation immediately, come visit us in the back left corner. We'll both be at our tables there, and we can talk more.
And your local hacker spaces, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Most big cities or big-ish cities have some sort of hacker space that you can walk into. And typically these people are incredibly nice, and they'll absolutely want to talk to you about what their project is, as long as they're not like in the middle of working on it. And that's a really great place to go and see what's going on as well.
Cool. Thank you all for coming out early this morning.
Thank you.